All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm Sami Atalla. I am going to be moderating the session. During the day, I am the director of the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies. And at night, I moderate sessions. So I must say I'm very impressed to see so many people coming to this event. And I think my colleagues share the same excitement. We were a bit worried when we were like, wow, 6:30. I mean, who's going to be showing up? But it seems rightly so that regional planning is a hot topic. I believe this is the last session for today. And the topic we're going to be addressing is regional planning and international donors. And maybe I'm just going to say just a few words before I introduce our panelists. But clearly, we're going to be looking at, in my thinking, two really major things. Sort of the challenges that we're facing currently in Lebanon vis-a-vis regional planning. And how should we look at cities? Are cities as regions? Are cities can do regional planning? What's the role of the national government? How can we, in fact, or how can the central government help regional planning or enforce it from one hand? And on the other hand, we're going to also have a really interesting interventions currently taking place by the international donor community. And they've been operating in Lebanon for many years, and some have initiated many projects. And they've sort of taken the lead in sort of maybe not imposing, but suggesting and enforcing sort of a way to think about regional planning. So we're going to be also giving them the floor to see how they're actually functioning, why are they functioning the way they're functioning, and so we also hear from their end. Now, a couple of things. I've actually asked all the panelists not to make formal presentations. I thought it would be more interesting to sort of have a more dynamic conversation, so it's going to be more of a Q&A format. So I'll be going back and forth, and obviously we'll give you the chance to actually ask some questions. Two other little points. One is that Mr. Ibrahim Shahrour could not make it, but we're very lucky that Mr. Sami Faghali is here from CDR, replacing him. And also, Mr. Jihad Farah is also unable to come because he's not feeling well. So this is just so you know the little changes in the program. We're going to start in the following way. I'm going to give the floor to Julia Guadagnoli, who is an MUUP candidate here, who is going to actually, she's the only one who's permitted to give a PowerPoint, just because they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. She can't put it in words, so we thought we'll just have a visual of the problem we're currently facing in Lebanon. So we're going to start with that, and this is prepared by Julia and Aziz. And I'm going to go with first name basis here because their bios is all with you on the website. They're going to sort of put it all out, and then I'm going to straight go to Sami from CDR to really understand what are really the problems currently we're facing in planning. And I'll take it from there. Julia, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you for
and Julia, you have few minutes, up to 5, 6.
7? My favorite number. Is this working?
Go ahead, Julia.
Yes. So thank you for having me in this panel. Yeah, I know I need to leave the floor to the roundtable pretty quickly. But I still hope that some of the speakers can take up some of the sketchy inputs that I will propose in this presentation. So the main idea here is that specific representations or conceptions of this tiny and diverse country, such as Lebanon is, narrow the options for regional planning in many ways. So revising these conceptions is crucial to broaden these options. In this regard, I will first show official administrative divisions versus the actual territorial organization of urban agglomerations. Then I will close by proposing an alternative perspective developed through the planning and design workshops offered by our program here at the department, where I participated as a student and as a teaching assistant, and that were offered by this guy here next to me. In a situation where different sectorial authorities overlap depending on the area of the country, the basic question about regional planning becomes who is in charge. Administrative divisions were defined according to sectorial criteria since the Ottoman times. And then they kept on changing during the French Mandate, the post-independence period, till the final decision in 2003 to this particular division of governorates that still in 2005 was contested in the National Physical Master Plan for the Lebanese territory as the result of a centrifugal tendency that was opposed to the unitary and integrated development approach of the same master plan. At the same time, the country is still ongoing a process of municipalization, as many areas are not covered by municipalities, and the federations of municipalities are constantly increasing, as we can see in this trend between 2003 and in these two maps between 2003 and 2011. We also can reflect on the sort of unsettled relationship between the state and its territory by looking at other divisions that are proposed in several documents, including the morphological areas identified by the master plan, but also, for example, reflecting on the fact that even the Central Administration of Statistics and the CNRS, the National Council for Scientific Research, couldn't agree on the same statistical areas, on using the same statistical areas. In addition to that, we have also can I say, incoherent divisions that apply to different authorities depending on utility networks. So looking more in detail at the National Physical Master Plan for the Lebanese territory, we see that there was an attempt at governmental level to provide regional frameworks for development. But basically, this was never applied because of the lack of actual administrative authorities regional authorities that could implement these frameworks. Meanwhile, while these attempts stay frozen on paper, actual processes are ongoing, shaping the territorial organization of the country. And we can start since 1964 with the idea of the polarization introduced by IRFAD, but then we have other processes. And we can see how the urban footprint is actually expanding beyond any capacity of the administrative structure of the country of taking control of that. So here I just want to look a bit more in detail about the agglomeration of Beirut and see how it is actually progressively eating the surrounding areas. And for example, Saida and Jounieh are progressively becoming suburbs of this huge hyper-centralized agglomeration. And Jounieh, who was identified as a main center in the diagnostic of the National Physical Master Plan, actually disappears in the proposal, basically because it is too close to the overwhelming capital city. So, and the problem with this overwhelming capital city is that it was very hard till now, historically, to find a definition for this agglomeration. So, and it has always been the result of based on political contestations. And in fact, all the attempts that have been deployed to manage this growth have failed due to the impossibility to find a common vision about, a shared vision about this territorial entity. So we can see here how the urban growth is actually ongoing between 2004 and 2010. Hi, Yara, the author of this map. Where is she? And we can see how the Kaza, like actually the agglomeration is expanding across different Kada. So on one hand, we have a problem of hyper-centralization that is affecting the center of the country. But on the other hand, there is a process of suburbanization that is affecting the areas surrounding the capital, but also it is affecting each secondary city in itself. And here we have the example of Saida, whose actually urban footprint built-up area covers, I think, something like 9 different municipalities. And we can see how this is organized in terms of land use, with the residential being all pushed to the hills, and the centers being more, with all the residents of Saida municipality actually living in other municipalities. So here, this all parade of maps, which I invite you to look more in details in another situation, was just to make the point that administrative subdivisions in Lebanon reflect the sectarian organization of the state rather than the spatial organization of the territory, and that in the absence of a coordination framework for territorial governance, scattered interventions miss opportunities for integrating broader regional and local development processes. So now we come to an alternative vision to these representations and territorial conceptions. That is what, as students of the program, we have been trying to experiment during the last, I think, 3 or maybe 4 planning and design workshops here at the department. So the first attempt with this different representation of space aims to alleviate the pressures on the center by reconceiving the agglomeration and reevaluating growth poles as integrated centralities. And this map, Hi Hayat, where are you? The author of this map, was just a preliminary vision that we came up in order to frame our analysis. And maybe later on during the Q&A, we can look at the strategic analysis, the strategic diagnostic that we came up with at the end of the class. So another key approach would be to understand territories as networks. And referring to yesterday's debate, I'm not trying to reinvent any wheel here. But of course, I don't have time now to quote references and everything. Eventually, develop orbital areas and activate interfaces to connect centralities and redistribute their pressures, applying criteria such as connectivity, multifunctionality, ecology, institutional capacity, and real estate market trends.
Thank you, Julia. This is wonderful, and you were on time as well. These maps are wonderful. I mean, to me, I'm always fascinated by maps. It really shows us how bad things are. And you haven't even talked about the refugees, you know what I mean, in terms of planning, but then we'll talk about that tomorrow. And I love the concept municipalization, which is, we'll get to that. But Aziz, I thought I'll give you the floor here and talk about, I want to know also the consequence of all of this, you know what I mean, on one hand. And what sort of framework you have in mind? Because already you sort of, I think, have discussed this or thought about that. So maybe you could sort of shed light on that, please.
Very mysterious object. Yes.
I mean, this is the result of 3 classes that work together. And basically, each class is invited to look at a particular context and look at the different sort of layers that happen in that context. So over 3 semesters, the students were mapping different sort of formations of territory in a particular specific one. One is a temporal one, sort of looking at the time issue. Basically, a class looked at mobility. And basically looked at the different speeds with which people move through the city, whether that is physical movement or financial movements or different flows across the city. And another one looked at territories and how they are emerging on some levels. And the third one looked at the relationships between different sort of zones of the city in terms of political and economic and demographic shifts. In all cases, one of the things that the students work with is not to invent idealistic solutions. This is not about creating a regional planning framework, as much as discovering where are correlations of different factors working together, including donor money, including real estate forces, including civil society actors, and where these things could be somehow aligned to create new changes on the territory. We're in a country with very low governance structures. And so the idea of coming up with these sort of idealistic notions of urban planning become rather ineffective. So instead, you have to work from the existing structures. What would take a local mayor? What would take the sort of donors to work? And then from those frameworks, the students were looking at juxtapositions that would reinforce certain centralities to emerge to counterweight the Beirut ultimate hypercentrality. So in each case, the students at the end of the day came up with realistic, feasible projects that involves shaping the landscape or shaping the urban forms that are emerging within a framework of what could local actors and national actors actually do. So this is where this is going. We can talk about it in more details. Again, it would be impossible to suggest a regional planning framework in a country like Lebanon at this time. I wouldn't think that it would work even in more central planning systems. What we have here is to perhaps sideline some of the more tendencies for centralizations when the central state can no longer afford certain things. So the questions that we probably will raise during the discussion is, where is the money coming from? Where are the responsibilities standing at the end of the day? Very clearly, some of the money is coming from donor contributions, but at the end of the day, there's no local funding to support it for maintenance, for operation, for depreciation. So what we're having is a continuous sort of run for the money, which is creating political patronage at the end of the day, rather than development. And
Very
we can
good.
talk about that.
No, this is a very good point, and I think you're focusing on the issue of local, the mayor, the donor, and my question is to Sami, the CDR, particularly from your perspective. We know that there's a Shema Directeur that was passed as a decree in 2009, and it just remains a document, as far as I know. How do you see that as a tool to solve some of these issues? Do you think is it still relevant? You know what I mean? This whole Shema Directeur vis-a-vis what we're seeing here, and how can we make it operational? So maybe you can just shed light on that. It's,
Excuse my voice in English, but I will try to get the message.
You're doing very well.
Regarding the statute.
Can you get it closer? It's on.
Okay, so I have to. Regarding the National Physics Master Plan, we have two main objectives in this statute. It is the principles of development of different regions and the utilization of varied spaces that make up the Lebanese territory. For the second objective, the utilization, the master plan defines all the directives that the DGU, Directorate General of Urban Planning, will take care for details. Regarding the principle of development of the different region, the key, as Mr. Halabi said, is Halaji, is the accompanying the master plan by a budget, and this is the key, I think, for the implementation of the master plan. the in the National Physical Master Plan report, we have a chapter that deals with the implementation of the master plan. And if you look at the chapter, we can see the role of every administration, what it has to do to implement the National Physical Plan. I can't say that this document is just a document. We are using it to implement a lot of projects. The DGU is using the National Master Plan to implement a lot of a lot of details when it comes to modify a local master plan, or when it comes to have projects in areas where there is no decrees of planning. Regarding the regionalization of the master plan, we did an exercise in 2010 to see how we can implement a strategic development regional planning, because some strategic plannings were implemented by different donors or different actors or different administration. And we see at that time that there is a different vision of strategic planning. Some of strategic planning were focused on the environmental, others on the social and economical matters, and others in the territorial and physical matters. So we did the exercise to have a common methodology to implement regional strategic planning. This exercise is available for each body who want to implement regional strategic plannings. And if we want to adapt the division of the master plan on regional planning, we can have 4 region planning in all Lebanon. One for the central area, Beirut and Mount Lebanon, and the second area could be the North Lebanon, Tripoli, and the area of the north, Bekaa and Tyre. When we did this exercise, we asked the consultant to look at subdivisions, because if a federation of municipalities wanted to do a strategic planning, how they can define their territory. We end to 5 major regions. Of the four regions that I already noted, with an exception for Batroun and Jbeil, because Jbeil in the National Physical Mass Planning is a part of the central area, and Batroun is a part of the north area. But we think that Batroun is not a full part of the north area, and Jbeil is not a full part. So we agreed on five regions, the fourth, and Batroun and Jbeil as a 5th area. For the south, for the sub areas, and to have a coherence in the territory, the exercise, and to have, for example, for Tyre, it's an exception, because the Kaza of Tyre could be a coherent territory. But when we come, for example, to the central area, we think that the upper area, the mountain, and could be a sub-region, while the littoral and the Région Moyenne could be another region. And unfortunately, I don't have the the map of the perimeters requested for the regional planning, but the exercise is available at CDR if someone would like. يعني
No, can I just follow up on this just quickly? The divisions that were made, the 4 and then the 5, I mean, I believe they're based on some topographical criteria. And so if you could shed light on that. And very quickly, my other question is, if you break them into 5 regions, what agencies would be actually governing these? I mean, how do you need some sort of authority, you know what I mean, to sort of take that, and what are the thoughts that were put with respect to that?
The 4 areas defined by the National Physical Plan is based on a functionality of the territory organization of the development of the different regions. Yani, if we talk the North Lebanon, we think that the north of Lebanon, if it has to be productive and to participate in the national economy level, we have to look at Tripoli as a center and to develop a lot of functionality in Tripoli, and from Tripoli to the secondary poles in the north. Yani every region has yani its proper functionality. For the topography, it comes after this level to have a coherence in the territory. So this is the 4th level in the, yeah. And as I told you before, Batroun and Jbeil could have. Regarding the who will be in charge, of course, we think that for the moment, as we don't have the decentralized institutions, we think that the Federation of Municipalities, they can take this role until we will have a decentralized governance.
Very good. Great, thank you. Just for those who don't know, I mean, what are these federations or federations of municipalities? Lebanon has more than 1,000 municipalities, and which is huge for a tiny country. Just to give you an example, Cyprus, which is of the same surface area as Lebanon, almost has 40, and we have 1,000 municipalities. I think maybe Croatia, which is probably the same size as Lebanon, has maybe 300 municipalities, but we have 1,000 municipalities. So the municipalities, what they've been doing lately, since 1978, but more recently after 2000, is they get together and they form what we call a municipal federation, which is they bring together to do some common projects, and that's what Sami is referring to as, you know, as a body, which we will also just tackle very soon about how effective these federations can be. I'm going to give the floor first to Tariq at UN Habitat. Tariq, you've been working on planning issues, and particularly on these RTOs, which are called, I believe, regional technical offices, to help in planning with the municipal federations, right? Can you just shed light on this experience and how effective, what are you trying to do, and what are the sort of the lessons learned from all of this in just 30 seconds?
30 seconds. 30 minutes, maybe. Thank you, Sami. Let me first just clarify one small thing. I mean, UN Habitat, it's not a donor agency. We are a small, tiny UN program that provides technical support, you know, to national and local governments, basically in issues related to planning. So this is just to clarify. Maybe if I just brief, you know, the experience of UN Habitat over the past 7 years very, very quickly, that can highlight the key challenges, that encountering the government with relation to the regional planning. I mean, as UN Habitat, we started our activities in Lebanon after the July 2006 war in South Lebanon, and we were working in housing reconstruction. And we approached the unions of municipalities or the Federation of Municipalities as the key strategic partners, as the local partners, because as we are all mentioning, that we have a huge number of municipalities with very weak resources, be it at the human resource level or the financial level. So also we found that at the union level we lack the expertise and the human resources. So what we created is the establishment of the technical offices within the unions. Those offices, they comprise from local experts. Basically, at the beginning, they were engineers because we were dealing with the housing reconstruction. And then we moved to the development of municipal projects. So the technical offices, they were working under the mandate of the union, but they were supporting all the municipalities that are registered under the union. And for instance, our experience in South Lebanon, we established 3 technical offices in 2007. In 2009, the project ended, but 2 of the unions took over the management of the technical offices, and until now they are still operational. I mean, when we worked with the unions, we found out that all the implementation of project is being done without any planning. So we thought to propose a kind of a planning at the union level. And at that time, Mr. Ziad Baroud came as the Minister of Interior and Municipalities, and this was a good opportunity where we were able to convince him to develop a training model on strategic planning for unions of municipalities. And when we started doing the training, and some of the unions, they moved with developing some plans, we found out that there is a missing link with the existing planning frameworks. So we had the National Master Plan, the Physical Master Plan, which was endorsed by CDR, by the government through CDR. And then we have the master plans being also developed by the Director General of Urban Planning. So we found out that we have like different planning tools, but that are not aligned in whatsoever way. So then we moved to the national level and we started dealing with the Director General of Urban Planning. We looked into the existing master plans, the laws and the regulations. And also we coordinated with CDR to look into the national master plan. And definitely we found out that there is a gap between the local level and the regional level, and the national level. And this is where we started, promoting the idea of having a regional level framework, that can project the directives of the national master plan, and that can take also from the local level, the vision and the objectives and the aspiration of the local authorities, and have it like in between as a midway. And because, as Sami mentioned, as maybe others are mentioning, the only structure that we have at the regional level is the unions of municipalities or the Federation of Municipalities. So we believe that supporting those unions can really help in promoting this regional level planning. Though we all know that in the anticipated decentralization law, the role of municipalities is not there. I mean, we are moving into more CADA council or district council. So this is also one of the key challenges. I mean, in our work, we are trying really to be realistic because we have to, to admit that in Lebanon, it's very tricky to change any of the existing regulations and bylaws. So we are trying to work on like a three-pillar thing, the legislation, and now we are negotiating with the Director General of Urban Planning to update the National Physical Master Plan to make it more practical and more understandable, by the unions of municipalities and municipalities, because until now they are not applying any of the directives of the national plan. It's all the DGU. And also we are working with the DGU to make the master plans, the local master plans, more relevant, to the maybe vision and aspiration of the municipalities. So this is at the national level. And of course, at the local level, we are working on building the capacities of the unions through, the establishment of the technical offices.
Very good. Tariq, I mean, thank you for mentioning the decentralization law, which I happen to have worked on drafting that law, and we, in fact, did suggest, or the whole law is actually based on making the Casa Council elected with the prerogative to do planning, and we have actually annulled the federations. And you might say, wow, and that was very controversial for the committee. And the reason, so here's another set of problems I want to sort of bring out. Okay, so we have too many municipalities, and I said the way they thought they're solving it is that they get together and form a federation. But then when you look at the map, and I think Julia had this map, which I think is right here, the one, the lower right-hand corner, you realize, in fact, there are some casas. The mapping of the unions to the casa is obviously not one-to-one, except maybe for two, Kisrwain and Sur and Tir, exactly. And the rest, you've got 1 or 2 or 3 unions within a district, within a casa. And some of them actually, not only there are many or several unions, but some of them are not contiguous. There's no linkage between, I mean, Jbeil is a perfect example. Jbeil the union of Jbeil is made up of 6 territories that are actually not linked to each other. So I'm wondering, how can you think of planning? So here we have another, I mean, defect, in fact, in the sense that how can we think of sort of planning on regional level using the federations and their set of problems and what have you. But in any case, I mean, sort of let's just bring that on the table and see, because we're dealing with another set of issues here. So when we thought of the law, among other things, we said, okay, you annul the federations and you have casa, so everyone, so the casa can think of the casa. But I think, Sami, you're mentioning that, and probably true, that 26, and I think casa is way too many. We don't need so many casas to do regional planning, I mean, at the end of the day. Ramzi, from the World Bank's perspective, I know you're also doing some work, and you're also relying on unions. We're using unions and federations here interchangeably. Tell us, you're a donor now. He's funded by a donor, but you are a real donor. You've got the money. What are you doing?
The bank.
So can you just shed light on the project that the World Bank is currently implementing?
Sure. Hi, and thank you very much for having us here. Thank you, Mona. Well, actually, before I start really telling you what the bank does in terms of the projects that we actually did start working with municipalities since 2000, let me just pick on actually one sentence that Mr. Hallaj mentioned that resulted out of the studies that were done by the students, is that they were looking for elements aligned to create change. Well, frankly, if we really think seriously about that, that is basically the whole thing that everybody's looking at this point, to try to see how we can come in and influence the process. We talk a lot about decentralization. Sami and our colleagues have mentioned municipalities, and you know very well that at the end of the day, unfortunately, there is a political economy in the whole process that we have to look at very carefully. Municipalities are created not because there is a need to create a kind of a development authority in that specific village or area. It's also a byproduct of a political interaction. So we have to be really realistic, and looking at the level of the unions or federation also, and Sami was mentioning these federations that are totally disconnected in geography, also asserts the point that there is a politics in the process, and it's not only mere development. And actually, I wonder whether it is development at any point in time. So I think having thought of this and then coming in and looking at carefully what is there, you look at the history of work that is being done at the level of municipalities, and Tariq from UN Habitat has mentioned a lot of things, and unfortunately this is not coordinated, this is not documented, and the question goes back to the who is there and who is supposed to be doing that. And that brings the question of the government. And who is the authority that should be compiling all of that data and provide us at least with a kind of a baseline based on which we can look at the experience that has been done so far, so that we don't end up financing projects that have been implemented. We can somehow rely on some statistics and studies that have been done, so we do not duplicate and go back again in spending money in a way that is not at least seen to be cost efficient and somehow affects the credibility of donors and government. So having said that, we have started working as a bank since 2000 and doing the first municipal project that was implemented with the Ministry of Interior and the Ministry of Municipalities. And that was supposed to be targeting and working at supplementing and reinforcing the basic infrastructure of municipalities all over Lebanon. All right, the project had a budget of $80 million. And that money has really to be channeled into projects that has focused on meeting priorities of municipalities. And I think the issue then, and it still is, and I think every donor who is going to be coming in is expecting something that is not there. And unfortunately, most of the discussion that took place in the London conference a few weeks ago that looked specifically on getting money and getting pledges for Lebanon and Jordan to meet the needs of the Syrian crisis and specifically for host communities, are expecting really to come in, go to municipalities or to unions and tell them what are your priorities, and these people would come up with a list of projects that are being well studied, that are being structured with feasibility studies, and I think the expectations are too high because we've seen it before and the capacities are not there. And unfortunately, because of the lack of coordination and because of the lack of this kind of harmonization between the donors and the authorities, both at the central and at the decentralized level, I think the people are clever enough to know what is the music to the ears of the donors. And they would give us exactly what we want. And unfortunately, these people who know that are not sometimes the true people who should benefit of these projects and not actually representing the areas that are really deprived and would lack of the resources to start implementing their projects. And I think this is the central issue that comes back on, are we really looking at the elements that create the change? So the project was started in 2000 on the municipal infrastructure, and let me just say openly and frankly, all right, that was before joining the bank, so maybe I can just shed a kind of a critical view on that project. It went all over the municipalities. It started really looking at priorities. And the municipalities did some kind of work with assistance to come out with projects. And the money was spent. Unfortunately, when those priorities were put on the table, well, a lot of issues started coming up, like doing an environmental impact assessment, looking carefully at these, and the municipalities didn't have the capacities to do that. And they found out that there has been a lot of risks in coming up with the projects they needed. After years and years of war, where these projects actually and these priorities have been inherited for years and years, and they saw in that an opportunity for them at least to do something that has been totally neglected by the government. So when we started putting some regulations, and a project needs to have an environmental impact assessment, especially if it's a project on water or solid waste or wastewater, and they don't have the capacities for that, and they don't have the mitigation measures, well, they decided immediately to shift and go into projects that are simple, straightforward. And probably, and it's not something to hide, that if you go into villages, you can see a lot of retaining walls. You can see a lot of trottoir, what do you say, sidewalks, in places where you don't have people. Why? Because they thought that this is an allocation that we do not want to lose. Is this what we want? So now, things are shifting. Yes, I'm sorry, I talk a lot, I know. But just going back to the project that we're implementing at this point in time, the bank is financing a project that is directly geared to deal with the situation of Syrian refugees in host communities. So basically the project is targeting host communities, and we're working in unions. Yes, we have selected 11 unions that have been deemed to be really in a critical situation according to two factors that we thought are important. One is the high presence of Syrian refugees in that specific union, and second, the high level of poverty as judged by the project of the Ministry of Social Affairs, which looked at supporting the extremely poor population. And we thought that having two factors, high presence of refugees as well as high poverty rate, is a kind of a explosive cocktail. So we have really to try to work out in diffusing the tension that might exist between the Syrian population and the host communities. So we targeted building or working in the rehabilitation of basic infrastructure projects that are suffering at this point in time because of the high population increase in those regions, and to try to see if by doing that, at least we're meeting a priority that has always existed for the host communities and for those specific unions. And at the same time, at least the host community would feel that because of the Syrian presence, if I may say, that priority has been met, and it benefits both population. And along that, we have a number of social activities that work on building this kind of social cohesion, if I may say, and reduce as much as possible the tension that might exist with the municipalities. One thing to add is that this is a hot issue. This is, if I may say, and excuse the word, this is a sexy issue, the issue of municipalities. In the London conference for donors, the question of decentralization, the question of supporting municipalities has been the main issue coming up and being focused on both in Jordan and in Lebanon. Thank you.
Ramsey, thank you so much. Hello. Just quick question on the criteria for choosing these unions, poverty and Syrian refugee. I don't know which 11 you're talking about, but by correlation, I would imagine that these unions have very weak capacities, or at least the municipalities there have weak capacities. So are you providing assistance, technical on that? Because are they able to actually handle the money to do the project, to implement it? Just because as a side note, I should mention that many municipalities have not even one single employee, 400 of approximately 400, maybe another 400 have one employee. Union situation is maybe slightly better, but maybe one or two employees. So we're talking about weak sort of capabilities. But can you just quickly shed light on that in terms of your providing some technical assistance as well?
Let me point out that the bank does not implement. Actually, the implementing agency is the CDR in this specific project. The same way the Ministry of Interior and Municipalities was the implementer of the 2001 first municipal project that was done by the bank. And yes, the issue of capacity also brings us to the question of Tariq, is that a lot of work has been done, as well as the ESFD, which Dima, our colleague, will be talking about, the Economic and Social Fund for Development. So there are a lot of capacity building activities that are taking place. And unfortunately, I can say, and probably, I don't know if Dima and Tariq agree, is that this is not coordinated. And I think that we have to make use at this point in time of this lapse of time available before we have any financing coming in, or before any donor just starts venturing into the idea of financing municipalities or unions directly. I think we have to think carefully about building the capacities. Yes, some people have the capacity, and that I'm sure during the discussion will come up, depends on the unions. You're talking about unions that have a good economic capacity, like we're talking of unions next to Beirut, while some other unions or some other municipalities are in rural communities that are totally deprived of any resources. So that also brings in a dimension that we have to look at carefully. The availability of NGOs in the region, the availability of other projects is also an element that has to be looked at. But I think there is a national need to look carefully into setting up a capacity building for unions and for municipalities in terms of really building up a development plan. Tariq talked about plans. Sami also, I'm sure Dima is going to talk about it. UNDP, other NGOs, ESFD, others are going into plans, and we cannot really keep going into doing plans and doing just shopping lists. Go back to the elements that create a change and try to see how we can fit that within the whole framework.
Very good. Ramsey, thank you so much. Dima, you have one. Dima from ESFD, which is the Economic Social Fund for Development, also not a donor, I believe, but funded by donor money. So, Dima, tell us more about ESFD first, because you're different. You're not dealing with unions. You have your own clusters. now. So tell us that. So it's more complication, and that's the reason why I left you to the last one, because you just add another new dimension to a complex situation for a country that's so tiny. Just can you tell us more about what are you doing exactly? What sort of activities? What sort of clusters and why?
Okay.
Okay.
First, who are we? The Economic and Social Fund for Development is a project that was created by the European Union and the Lebanese government back in 2002. Its main objective is poverty alleviation. Our target areas are mainly also in the peripheries and the rural areas. How we do poverty alleviation, we mainly do it through two components. First component is called job creation, where we support the private sector and mainly small and medium enterprises through loans. The second component is the community development, where we are going to elaborate more now. The community development component also targets the rural areas in Lebanon, mostly not rural yet, mainly the most disadvantaged areas in Lebanon, in order to improve living conditions and in order to empower these communities in local planning, in diagnosing their situations and all this. So in this context, in the context of poverty alleviation and empowerment of local communities, we had a few experiences in planning. So we had also this mixture, but it was mainly on the local level. But we experienced with different structures, which ranged between municipalities. Sometimes we worked with a cluster of communities which do not have municipalities. Also, that was a unique experience, which also we did it at the time of Mr. Ziad Baroud, who also supported us in formalizing this structure. And we had an experience with a cluster of municipalities. Also, we were working with Sami on this program, Adelnor. So mainly that was our experience. Our rationale to choose the clusters was that to also try to create, even if it does not exist, to create a coherent structure for planning, for cooperation, for implementing development projects. So I would like just to mention the few criteria that we applied in order to create clusters, where we intervened in creating participatory local development plans, in financing development plans, and in giving the cluster of municipalities the power or the responsibility to manage the grant, to implement the projects, and all this. So the few criteria that we used we applied to create these, select these clusters were the following. First, territorial continuity. We looked, we made sure that the communities, they shared the same natural resources, road networks, water resources. So there was like this geographical and territorial continuity. Social cohesion. We also chose this criteria in order to make sure that people in these communities are ready to work together. They have social relations, they can work together to plan together, implement together projects. A third criteria was, of course, socioeconomic situation, mainly the absence of basic services, the poverty levels of these communities. So that was also another criteria. And at the end was the potentials and capacities. We made sure that to find in this cluster at least the minimum of capacities, whether in the local authorities, CBOs, or local civil society organizations, to have minimum capacities for us to be able to have partners in this cluster, to help us in planning and later in managing and implementing development projects. So that was in brief why we chose cluster and based on what criteria. I would like just to note that especially relating to what Ramzi said about capacity. Of course, that was the main challenge to work at the local level, whether with municipalities, unions, or clusters of municipalities. But I think that also after long experience at the local level, I think there is a great advantage. And now we are experiencing it more and more, especially when we are trying to identify like quick projects, because we are pressured by donors, we have money for the Syrian crisis, we have to implement, we have to. I think the local actors, whether they are unions or municipalities, or they are the ones who know the realities. And once we implement a project that was chosen by them, it doesn't mean a quick decision, but the process itself, the process of self, to involve these local actors, I think the process by itself is a good indicator which can ensure ownership later for these projects. And I think this point should be highlighted, that ownership of projects, of plans, is very important at the local level. So this is mainly what we did. I don't know if
Very good.
you need to-
My
to
quick
know.
question on how do you coordinate with the other agencies, authorities,
So I also noted another point which I wanted to.
you will have
Yeah, we coordinate. Yeah, we coordinate both in planning. As I said, when we intervene in one community or a cluster of communities, we did what is called participatory local development plan. Okay, the aim of this plan is not only to do a plan. The aim is to empower these people, to empower them to start diagnosing their own realities, identifying their problem, needs, projects, etc. So at the level of planning, when we do this planning, we do what is called the stakeholder analysis. We look for all the stakeholders who are working in this area, in this region, and so we do this stakeholder analysis in order to know what is working, who is working here, who did plans here. So this coordination is done at the planning level. At the implementation level also, when we reach the identification phase of identifying a project, usually we do it, and now we are doing it more because also we learned a lot from our experiences. We're doing a lot with the public administrations, even like CDR, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, because as we said, there are some responsible stakeholders for each sector, for infrastructure, education, health. So we go to these stakeholders and we tell them, for example, we have to do, like, let's say, an education center here, and we do an agreement with the Ministry of Education so that it can take in charge later the project. Another point which I would like to add, beside ownership, which I think this is the main advantage of the whole process, is also linking the central with the periphery. Because as we all know that the central institutions are absent in the peripheries, as I said, like centers for health centers, centers for Ministry of Social Affairs, infrastructure. So our role also is, through our project, is to bring the state institutions to these areas. So that was also one of the objectives of the whole process that we are implementing.
Very good. Dima, thank you so much. I'm going to open the floor now to questions.
Can I just quantify things on the micro level just to explain a little bit?
We can, for in 1 minute, you can do that.
2 or 3 minutes, yeah.
Just because I want to give the people the chance. So can you, as brief as possible.
The municipality of Saida in 2013 had on the books 52 projects that were planned at a net worth of about $450 million, which was supposed to be mainly funded through donor funds. Some of it is grants, some of it is actually loans on the Lebanese government. Of those projects, if they were implemented, the municipality could only recover indirect revenues that would cover less than half of the cost of maintenance, never the cost of depreciation. Half of the project actually were in contradiction with the master plan, the regional master plan. In principle, These projects would collectively increase the national debt about $50 per capita on every Lebanese. Because there's no way of recuperating them. So it is the central taxes of Lebanon that are supposed to pay for them, but they are never paid. So in a sense, the national debt is increasing because of these things. These projects are pushed by powerful naib, powerful members of parliament.
Yeah.
And in a sense, the projects are led politically on one level.
Do you have the name of the MP?
They're led politically on one level. The implementing agencies, for instance, in terms of the physical infrastructure, is CDR. So CDR built a very impressive sewer line, but at the end of the day, the sewer was still going into the water untreated because the institution that's supposed to run the thing does not have the fund to run it. A hospital was built, so there's a beautiful brand new hospital that has nothing in it, it's empty, because the organization that builds it is different than the organization that will be eventually running it. And then at the end, the list goes on and on and on.
Yeah.
So in reality, what we're having here is a lot of waste of money, uncoordinated funds, particularly because of these sort of lost jurisdictions. And the end cost is that every time there's a pork valor project, the national debt on Lebanon will increase.
Very good. Thank you, Aziz. No, that was valuable. I'm glad I gave you the floor. Just because, just to add 2 sentences to this. So it's not money wasted, obviously. It's wasted, obviously. But obviously there are people benefiting from this, right? You know what I mean? This is corruption at its best, you know what I mean? And this is, I want to bring up the issue of political parties, where they kick in, how they're benefiting from this. Because all of these, the pipes not connecting, it's not a rocket science, right? Someone's benefiting from this. Anyway, enough of this. I had a hand somewhere here. Please, can you introduce yourself and make it short, because I see many hands, and then, yeah.
Hi, Aline Rahbana من World Vision. It's an international NGO. My question is about the topic of social cohesion that was mentioned by 2 speakers. Recently, World Vision worked on a literature review on social cohesion between Syrian refugees and urban host communities in Lebanon and Jordan. And we tried to define social cohesion, and based on the literature, we found that it has a 2-way definition. The first one is horizontal, and it's the interlinkages and dynamics between groups that are existing in the community, so horizontally, and then it's vertical. And this means it's the linkages and interactions between those groups and the governing structures above them. So my question here is, you've mentioned social cohesion as one of the activities or approaches that you're trying to promote. Given the existing history between the refugees and the host communities in Lebanon prior to the crisis, and the tensions that already existed between the Lebanese communities before the crisis, and given the weak and non-participatory governance that exists in Lebanon, how do you envision materializing and operationalizing the social cohesion and the plans that you put together?
And this is targeting who do you want to? Both of them. Very good. Mona, and then.
Yes, thank you to the panelists. I have what I think might be a provocative question. After hearing you, I'm really not convinced that municipal unions should be regional planning agencies. And I'm wondering why should we support them to play a role they're not designed to play? And why is it that we do not encourage instead the creation of regional development authorities or agencies, like what was suggested by the methodology that you mentioned, Mr. Ferrali, in the study that was done to CDR, which is independent regional development agencies that are much more technical, that have a technical function of planning at the spatial level at territory, and conceiving directions of development, and then will be executed by unions and local authorities, by village development plans like ESFD is doing, by policies that the World Bank want to implement. But having a regional level development strategy that defines the whole territory on a spatial level that links regions together, territories together, agriculture and industry and tourism and development in an integrated, holistic way. For me, I don't see at all the burden we're giving to municipal unions as, you know, as being the leaders of planning and development. I think Sami mentions how weak they are. And so I'd like to just like throw in and maybe go back to Aziz, who was saying that he doesn't believe in this. And I'd like to hear him on why you wouldn't support that, like the creation of agencies at that scale.
Right, thank you. Gentleman over there.
Hi, my name is Daniel. I work with CARE International. So I'll be speaking a few things about from that perspective, but I think my question will be more as a citizen, not as CARE International. I would just start by saying that from Aziz and Mr. Ramzi, I mean, the comments you made were really hit hard. It gave me a knot in my stomach, and you'll understand why in a second. I just wanted to say that the conference in London has given us record money. Okay, we have around over 4,000 functional NGOs in Lebanon. Functional meaning that they're actually doing something. And we have over 10 to 15,000 that are registered, probably even more. And then you've made the point very clear that municipalities cannot take on this burden. For two reasons, probably because they don't have the planning capacity, and second, they don't have the operational capacity. Now what Tariq talked about and what UN Habitat is doing is very interesting. But we all believe and we all know that when the money comes, and I'll tell you now that it's already come. I mean, tomorrow I have a meeting about a proposal on local governance and if we're going to go for it or not. So the money's already here. It's going to go to municipalities and it's going to flow very, very fast. This happened post-2016. And a lot of money went to strategic planning, regional plans, and there were a lot of plans that were just sitting around. We all know that at a personal level in our lives, when we want to plan our own lives, our own objectives, it's a learning process, it's ongoing. So being a bit donor-driven, being a bit project-based, what needs to happen? So you mentioned to look at the elements that create change. So my question is twofold. What needs to happen at the municipal level? And what needs to happen at our level of experts, of activists, of the watchdogs? What do we need to do to make sure that this doesn't happen again? And my question will probably go to Aziz, Mr. Ramzi, and Tariq.
Very good, thank you. Gentleman behind you.
My name is Shadi Ghajar, ex-UNDP. I would like to ask, when do you think we should bring the private sector on board? We've talked about planning. I believe in all these structures, but at the implementation stage, at least, where we are supposed to bring it on board.
Very good. I'm going to stop here. I know I have a couple of hands which I noted down, but I'm going to give the chance for the panelists to answer. On social cohesion, I believe Ramzi and Dima. Dima, you want to go first? Thank you.
Yeah, on social cohesion, I would like to clarify that what I mentioned, that was done before the Syrian refugees. So what we meant by the criteria of social cohesion is the social cohesion between Lebanese themselves, like they have social relations, they can work together, you know. This is what I meant by the criteria I mentioned. But for now, I think to create social cohesions between Lebanese and Syrians through the processes we are implementing right now, I think the major factor is to recognize both, you know, to involve both groups in the whole process, you know, not to do like as we did in the beginning of the crisis, to concentrate a lot on the Syrians and the Syrians and to ignore the Lebanese. So So now the process of development at the local level should include both groups, you know, in the objectives of planning and in the implementation of project to take both needs into consideration. So I think this is the practical approach to it.
Okay. Thanks, Sima. Ramzi, let's go with the social cohesion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. But if I may, just because touching on this probably would touch on some of the things that were mentioned by our colleague from CARE, is that, yes, thank you, Mr. Rahbani. Social cohesion, yeah, I've seen the study that was done by World Vision. Again, I go back to exactly what Dima was mentioning. Maybe talking about the current situation now between refugees and host community is probably something that's going to take us outside the scope of this session. But I would rather really focus on the social cohesion at the local level. And I'm talking about this citizen engagement at the level of the local communities. And I think this is very important because that brings also the capacities of the municipalities and what they have mentioned in terms of looking at stakeholder analysis and looking at the elements. So all of these are linked together. And on that, let me just point out that I believe fully in the capacities of municipalities as well as the capacities of NGOs. I come from an NGO background, so I know and I've worked very much on that. And I think this is where the two are playing a major role in bringing this social cohesion that we're talking about at the level of the local communities. And I think the municipalities are in a position to come back, or at least to make a leap in being a major player, building on the question that we have mentioned on capacities and making sure that they are in a good governance, if I may say. And that's also what Muna has alluded to in terms of looking at the unions. At the end of the day, we are part of a culture. If we are talking of corruption in one point, we cannot deny it in other places. Municipalities, unions are a miniature of what exists in the country, and you know very well what is there. So there is nothing to hide, and we cannot hide. So we have to be really pragmatic in dealing with what exists. And I think the credibility of the municipalities comes in that it's dealing with its constituents, in opening up, and I think putting a plan in consultation with everybody, including the private sector, who can play a major role in that. So at the level of the municipalities, I think this is very important. If you want to be legitimate, you have to make sure that you are bringing everybody on board, and I think this brings this social cohesion element, and I think that gives the municipalities strength, and that's also something that they can mitigate the risk now with the presence of the crisis that we have, both at the center, at the horizontal, as you mentioned, in dealing, as well as the vertical. But my point is always that we cannot just float in space. We have to refer to an authority somewhere, and I think this is where, on the table, we should have had probably a representative from the Ministry of Interior. There is a governing agency. There is a government. There is an authority that's supposed to be at least putting down the plans and regulating the process. Probably they cannot implement, and that's why NGOs and that's why international agencies are trying to help, but they have to be putting an overall plan that brings in coordination and actual implementation.
Very good, thank you. I want to give the floor to Sami. You want to respond to the issue of Mona is
I would like just to note that after the completion of the National Physical Master Plan, we elaborate in CDR in 2006. The master plan was completed in 2004. We elaborated a development plan in conformity of all the directives of directive. And in this development plan, we review all the sectors policy, the politique sectorielle of the education, wastewater, water, the transportation, health, all these sectors. We review all the policy sectors in cooperation with the ministries. And we we propose for 15 years term all the prioritized infrastructure projects to implement what we recommended in this master plan. This development plan was submitted to the Council of Ministers, and it was at that time we were the Conseil des Ministres didn't look at this development plan. It wasn't in the ordre du jour of the Conseil des Ministres. Regarding the Union of Municipalities, if they have to have planning, and the agencies that you mentioned, and the National Physical Plan, we recommend agencies in the regions, in the 3 regions, to promote and to encourage the investments in these regions, and to have a communication and media. We didn't mention agency to have a planning. At that time, nous avons misé to the decentralized law, or to have a decentralized or regional administration that will take care of the planning. And in the absence of this decentralization, I can see that to have a minimum of planning to response of the flow of financing that we don't have any other body now. I agree with you that we need to look at this perimeters more carefully, but in the absence of decentralized, we agree. I think that the Union of Municipalities must have at least a minimum of vision, of future vision, to when they get the money to have already thought about their future, and to have the right projects needed when they have the financing. That's all. Yeah.
Thank you. Tariq.
Thank you, Sami. Maybe I disagree with some of the discussion that is related to the capacities and to the performance of municipalities and unions of municipalities. I mean, maybe the discussion has shifted into, instead of talking about the regional planning, more talking about, the unions of municipalities and their role. I mean, briefly, according to our experience, if really, municipalities or unions are giving the opportunity to work well with some support and some capacities, they can really do some good work according to their, existing capacities. Well, I think that one maybe of the key challenges that maybe we didn't really highlighted a lot today, maybe you mentioned it quickly, is the definition of the region. And this we know that has been going on for years. Is it a union? Is it a district? Is it a cluster of municipalities? So I think maybe this is one of the key issues that we need to look into in the in the coming future. Especially, I mean, if we look into the borders of the boundaries of the cities, they are not anymore the administrative boundaries. If you talk about Tripoli, if you talk about Beirut, Saida, Nabati, Zahli, any of those cities, now they have really went beyond the administrative borders. And I mean, if we look at the existing policies and at the existing regulations, they are still very much according to the administrative, borders. So this is where we really have the key issue that we need to look at, because if you want to talk planning, and especially, urban planning, it's not now anymore the administrative border, it's more the space. And this is, I think, the key question, the definition of the space.
Thanks, Tariq. Just before I give the floor to Aziz, the issue of borders and administrative borders. Before I was on the committee, in fact, that drafted the decentralization law, I had just written something on regional administrations, and I was actually suggesting that we need to redraw the map of Lebanon on a developmental basis. And based on my sort of little knowledge, I thought maybe we should not have 26 Kaza, but not 8 muhafaza. Maybe we need sort of 10 to 12 regions. And this was just an intellectual exercise as I was sort of articulating in a policy brief that was published by LCPS literally a month before I was assigned. So when I walked into this committee, I was like, oh, this is a great opportunity for me to sort of share this with the committee members. And when I brought it up, I said, look, we can't think of the 26 Kaza anymore because these are, in fact, they're small, you know. Let me just say, after a year and a half being in that room in the presidential palace, twice a week going and talking about these issues, I realized at the end of the day, we should not, I would be very worried to redraw anything today, because the minute you bring a pen to redraw, it starts going so sectarian, because we even sort of intellectually talked about it, and it's so scary. Now, and not because we're different. Let's just make sure. It's not because sectarian, because the Shia are different from the Sunnis. Sunnis are, no. Just because of power, right? I mean, everyone wants his own sort of fiefdom, you know. So I was like, okay, forget it. Don't redraw anything now, and particularly now because all the different communities are way more powerful than 30 or 40 years ago when these were drawn, right? So, you know, and then just as a footnote, Ramzi suggested the Ministry of Interior, and this mainly reminds me of a little story, which I think you're right, this should be here. But when we were working also on municipalities, and we thought that we should help the Ministry of Interior looking at local governments and figuring out how strong, how weak, what are the good things and the bad things. So there was a project, maybe partially funded by the World Bank at one point, maybe, and then by the Italian corporation, to set up an observatory, which is to collect the data. And remember, Tariq, we were there together, you know, on this issue at one point, which we're collecting data. A lot of data for the Ministry of Interior. And one time I was discussing it with the head of the Municipal Affairs department at the ministry, and he was just, and I was telling how important this observatory is. And he said, but where is it? You know, where's the observatory? And for a second, I was like, what do you mean? There's 4 computers and we're collecting the data. But then I actually think he thought that was going to be literally an observatory with the binoculars, you know, where we could actually watch over the municipalities. Aziz, sorry about this.
Sorry, but can I just give a small comment very quick?
Yes.
Just regarding, you know, the redrawing the map of Lebanon. I mean, if we talk like small example, when the Shahib committee was discussing the solid waste, you know, the garbage problem, and it meant to be that municipalities will play a major role in this one. And they requested municipalities, you know, to work together and to group themselves according to the size of the area, according to the population, and come with the suggestion which municipalities will work together, you know, and which municipalities will work together to manage the solid waste. So, you know, this is a simple example that could be applied, you know, because, and this maybe clustering can work because they are connected geographically, the number of population is reasonable, you know, the municipalities can handle this thing. So, I mean, there are some attempts that can really work. So this came from the government and not from anybody else.
Very good, thank you. Aziz.
Yeah, I mean, there's a big elephant in the room, and that is the legacy of the civil war in Lebanon. And that big elephant is still there, it's alive, it's taking the biggest bulk of the room. The reality of the matter is that there are certain balances that were created in the Ta'if that is sort of created a certain political economy, and that political economy is more or less what's running the scene. So if wherever we're going to mess with that layer, there's going to be layers of resistance to this thing. Part of the exercises that the students have done in every one of those towns is to look at who are the stakeholders dealing with real estate. What are their connections to the political class, and what is their connection to the church or the mosque or the waqf in every area. And you can complete the dots. there's a whole cycle of things that eventually ends up reinforcing each other. Many of the municipalities in Lebanon are nothing but real estate development companies. They have no other function. Now, of course, they have a sectarian cover to begin with, so they put the sectarian thing as a cover to a very complex real estate business at work. And there's a whole sort of framework of speculation in land, which sort of creates environments that are impossible for real businesses to emerge, because speculative development squeezes the life out of all possibilities of other development in the country. So again, with the framework of money coming from outside of Lebanon, this is basically the main business in Lebanon. If we want to look at numbers, and I like to look at numbers, there's approximately $70 billion worth of idle real estate sitting in Lebanon. How much is the national Lebanese debt? Very close to that figure. So somehow over 25 years, the political economy of Lebanon has managed to establish on the public accounts a debt of about $70 billion, which ended up being as a surplus in the private sector. That's the big picture. Now, when we go into the more detailed and nuanced sort of looking at things, we need to go back to understand a little bit whether we create other agencies within that framework, whether that would have some sort of a level of accountability to local, or is it going to be part of the deconcentrated and but not decentralized authorities? I mean, in Lebanon, that whole thing is about whether at the end of the day, I'm paying taxes to whom, who will be accountable to me. At the moment, people pay taxes to the central government. And who is the contact to the central government is the parliamentarians and not the municipalities. The municipalities have very little ability to actually get funds from central government. They are actually much better at getting funds from donors than from central government. And this is where donors have come into the picture in creating new realities on the ground, manipulating, the scene of where centralities are emerging in Lebanon. Very often the students have actually been able to sort of map very clearly, okay, so this donor brought the money via this stakeholder in the city, and it's a whole sort of patronage system that works in terms of consolidating centralities as they are emerging in Lebanon. Now, within that framework, the question is, how do you bring more revenues to the municipalities and make that money more accountable to the local electorate? If the municipalities, at the moment, their biggest source of revenue is the fees they get from leasing and real estate and building permits. That's their biggest source of revenue. So if you have a hammer, every problem in the world becomes a nail. At the moment, the municipalities don't have other sources of revenue. They cannot capture the $400 million of development. They cannot get that into taxes. All of the taxes that would emerge from that package of development is actually going to the central government. And very often it's not, because it's not being taxed, and there's no taxes in Lebanon. And part of the reason why we have $70 billion worth of surplus capital in Lebanon is that there's no real taxes. So at the end of the day, we have a system that reinforces itself, that defends itself, like Sami was saying. And within that framework, what you can do is not major transformations. You can do minor shifts. And strategically, the questions that have to be asked at this moment is, how do we empower municipalities? How do we make whatever supra-municipal territorial entities more accountable, whether that is the union or whether it's eventually the qaza, as it's supposed and proposed by the draft law. And actually, the draft law is a lot more smart in that it's basically bringing back accountability. There's elections on the level of the qada. And that's the key issue. We need to break the cycle of where the political patronage is taking place by creating not better, more, let's say, clean people in place, but by contesting the power of parliamentarians and creating entities that can represent local interests from a developmental point of view. All of these put together brings us to the issue of not whether we need another agency, but we need more layers of accountability. And accountability comes by changing also the tax. If I don't, if my tax is not going to you, you're not going to be accountable to me. So that's the main issue that needs to be reconsidered.
Thank you, Aziz. I'm going to take two more questions. I know because there were Nancy and the gentleman over here, and then we'll end it, please.
I'm going to be very quick. I don't have effectively a questions. I was about to defend the municipalities and the local level. I would repeat what Dima said, that local level, they know their problems, they know what they have. But also we cannot only rely on them to tell us what they want, because sometimes they don't have the capacity and the expertise to know what they want. So they would say, I need a project to develop the woman, to empower the woman, and they will ask for sewing machines. So we need, as development agencies, to be there and to support them. And I would like to say that one of the main challenges that development agencies have are that the municipalities are weak. But also we don't have donors who are willing to provide us or to fund such capacity building activities. And this is one of the main issues. I don't know why. There's many political questions about that. I would like also to say that, to strengthen what Ramzi said, that the role of the government is very essential here. And yes, the government or maybe the CDR must be the leading party who must be coordinating all the aid and all the fund that is coming into the country. And unfortunately, until this time, we don't have a real government entity who is taking the lead. I'm trying to be very quick, and I would like to say, strengthen on the importance of the National Master Plan. And I want to give an example from my experience with UNDP. When I was the government focal point, taking all the projects that are requested by the communities through a participatory approach and going to ministries that are in charge of these sectors, and then coordinating them with the CDR within the master plan. And we found out many problems. Some of the municipalities requested projects that either contradict the master plan of the CDR or that are already within the master plan and that are already awarded to many suppliers or contractors. And here also the coordination among the different parties is very essential. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Nancy. Last question. Please.
Mine will be not really a question, but perhaps a contribution to your debate. Well, actually, you're talking about institutional reforms, right? How you go about just redesigning the whole system, but right, there are also two related questions. So you have like 4,000 NGOs active now, and you also have the private sector. The thing is, if you are talking about development, apparently we are not talking about socialist path of development, right? Otherwise, it's capitalist. So then there are two things that to think about. Well, institutional reform comes or shaped by shifts in the power balances, right? So if you are going to really, if you think that the regional governance would really solve the problem, then you'd better start by like redesigning the civil society and the private sector around the regional interest issues, right? So and here, what sectors of capital would be more interested in promoting a regional level of governance? So you cannot reform the government, but you can create pressure on the central government to reform it. So play with strategic sectors of capital and make them push for change.
Great. Thank you very much. I think we're over time. I don't know if my panelists have any last comments to make. Otherwise, we will just say good night. Thank you so much.
Can I just make a very quick...
30 seconds.
Yeah.
10 seconds. لا, no, he wants to talk as well. Quickly, بس يلا.
Just let me
يلا.
just you mentioned the question of donors and going to municipalities. Actually, we don't really want municipalities to end up being on their own like NGOs. You've mentioned NGO, sir. We did a study in 2004, and we had 6,000 NGOs registered at the Ministry of Interior. Out of those, we followed up only probably 1,200 were actually there, and out of those, around 750 were effective and active. So you have an idea that yes, the NGO sector is a strong sector. Yes, it's something that we consider a strength in the society, and we need to build on. Municipalities also are an element of strength. I think if we look at good governance, so basically we have to work on that, and building capacity. It's a hand-holding within a good governance, and definitely not on their own within a kind of a overarching national structure.
Thank you, Ramzi. Aziz?
Just very quickly, some of the way the donors have actually contributed to the problem is that they have packaged their money in terms of projects. We need to move away from that. In a sense, we need to look at value chains and look at creating synergies between the different processes at hand. Very often, the donors are less imaginative than the municipalities themselves. Not everybody, but I'm just talking in general. So the question at hand is how do we aggregate the results of donor money into processes that can be sustained, reworking or re-influencing or recalibrating certain sectoral interventions. The problem at hand is, from experience on the ground, is that fighting over which sectors become again part of the political economic fight. So the question is, how do you, through donor money, recalibrate these things without saying Saida is going to be a tourist town, so everything else must be killed in the city, and in a sense you're reinforcing those stakeholders who want it to be touristic. So the question at hand is not to rechange the structure of the sectors, but to create value change that will subtly, very subtly rebalance certain things and ensure that at the bottom of the value chain, more value is retained. I have one student who actually did a very excellent project, Rayan, at the time, looking at compiling different elements, creating a value chain that actually accommodated the refugees, provided the absentee Lebanese landlords with feasible solutions for their vacant lands, created a win-win situation in the process, and created local labor that actually benefited everybody. So looking at this sort of level of solutions is where we need to be heading.
Thank you, Aziz. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Sorry.